Hello, Wake Up New Zealand, Carol Sakey speaking. Well, people, I hope you've been watching Counterspin, our latest one and only media program, media site. It's on every Monday and Thursday at 8 p.m. They've had some very interesting speakers on there. And I want to reflect on two of those episodes. Number 6 is coming up on Thursday night, but I want to reflect on two of them. One was about the Lake Alice abuses of children and adults, which was horrific, and the other being that of the latest episode of Carleen Henora when she talked about the abuse of children in New Zealand state care. Horrific events. And when I was sort of listening to them, I was thinking, well, who is being held responsible? Are the police doing their job properly? Is stuff being covered up? Who is not talking up? And who is getting away with this? And also the judicial, what is happening there, and the government, and how they are all falling down. Nothing is transparent, and we should be worried about this. You may say, well, it's happened in the past. Hey, but this case, as far as Carleen Honora is concerned, where she is supporting these people, these young people, they've now grown up now, but she is supporting them through this case of abuses through the High Court, and I believe there's still one to go. Yeah, it's just horrific, and I feel that we don't hear everything that's going on. There's much left unsaid and a lack of accountability. So if you hear of colouring actually coming into your area, where you are, I urge you to go and listen to what she has to say, because you would be quite surprised, I believe, as to what's going on in state institutions in New Zealand. In New Zealand, across the board, we have a very high rate of sexual abuse of children. I did hear in about 3 years ago, it was 1 in 3 children, and that's horrific. So, World News reported. Now, let's get on to the United Nations, because what we have is New Zealand government is the long arm of the UN, and they were part of the founding of the UN. They are co-founders of the UN, New Zealand government, and the actual founders of the UN, if you go back before 1945, was that Roosevelt and Stalin actually met in Tehran in Iran. Together they established the Yalta Agreement. And if you think about that, this is all part of the setting up of the UN, an important part. So Stalin was a key player in setting up the UN. The UN as we know it today, Stalin, who killed millions of his people by starving them to death and torturing them. And that's where the UN comes from. And it was set up post the Second World War to deal for a peaceful world, a wonderful world of utopia that has never existed, to stop wars. But now we have, in the last 3 years or so, civil war has increased and increased and increased in many countries across the world as socialist, Marxist, communist government leaders of UN member countries clamp down from the top down onto civilizations, populations worldwide with their totalitarian laws, strict regulations, surveillance, tracking, tracing, persecuting, in a bid to stop nationalism, democracy, civil rights, human rights, clamping down, trying to squash all of that, to make populations around the world slaves to the UN One World governance. So while we're talking about the UN and the UN that plays a part in every part of our lives, from infrastructure, health, law, everything you could mention, even down to food, as our government quickly, with great haste, is changing the laws around land and water, which will affect our food supplies, targeting farmers. But UN goes further beyond that, as it talks about in UN Agenda 2030 about protecting women, girls, children, as UN forces, NATO, global health agencies are involved with sexual exploitation of children, of women, and it's becoming increased. And we're talking about the UN as perpetrators of abuse at all levels of the UN. So the World News reported in on July the 19th, 2019, on how big the UN corruption and scandals are. It also reported about the 2018 Oxfam sex scandal, where a prominent member of Oxfam was actually raping women forcefully for the exchange of food and medication. And this is getting more common in world global aid agencies, where perpetrators actually escape prosecution and jail sentences, where whistleblowers are threatened, blackmailed, silenced not to talk up. So all this can go on undercover. So Reuters News in January 2019 quoted that UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres as saying, the UN as an organization was founded on equality, human rights, dignity, really, and they must lead the way as to those standards. Well, they don't. They absolutely don't lead the way. They shamefully actually have broken every human rights law there is, as they allow the biggest human rights abuser, violator, to sit on the UN Security Council, China, representing the CCP, that commits genocide, tortures, has 1 million or so people in their detention centre, mass surveillance, organ harvesting, live organ harvesting with a live organ harvesting bank. It's horrific, and they continue to get away with it. And recently, as a motion passed through Parliament in New Zealand, they take down the Labour. Says, well, we're past it, but you've got to take that word genocide out for our friends at the CCP. We can't have that, so we'll just have human rights abuses, shall we? Because trade becomes much bigger than human rights, than a genocide. And what does Ardern say? She says, we refer that back to international laws. International laws comes from the UN Security Council, where China has veto rights, and this will damn well go on forever and ever and ever. It will never be seen to. So our government And the UN are allies of genocide, sexual violations, forced rapes, forced sterilizations, the killing of innocent people, the genocide, the huge internment camp with 1 million or so people. And the UN that directs every part of our lives, also people in all levels actually being involved with sexual violation, sexual exploitation of children, of women, of boys. So for dignity and human rights. So under the UN administration, they foster a reputation of being champions at sexual abuse, which they actually call sexual harassment. So, and they get away with this criminal behavior. So sexual abuse, sexual exploitation claims made against UN troops, peacekeeping troops. Michelle Sidibe, former executive director of the UN Agency for HIV/AIDS, UN AIDS Programme, stepped down in June 2019, 6 months before his term was about to expire. And 2 more of his colleagues stepped down too. Why? Because they're all guilty and it's evidence-based of sexual abuse and sexual exploitation. And it goes on. And so they were given congratulations. Thank you for your term that you served with the UN. They exited with dignity, nothing being done about it, not being held accountable. So they were thanked for their time in office. And this is a serious problem right throughout the UN as cover-ups go on, whistleblowers are silenced and blackmailed and threatened, and the UN covering up sex exploitation, sexual abuse, human trafficking in Bosnia, Haiti, Sudan, Congo, and elsewhere in the world. So the global national propaganda media, that's your propaganda machine, neglects to report UN corruption, this sexual exploitation, yet UN Agenda 2030, what does that say? Includes the protection of girls and boys and women. They forget the men. Yet they target women, children, girls, boys. They're perpetrators of these people that they're supposed to be protecting. These children, these women they're supposed to be protecting. So, whistleblowers are silenced as there's increased numbers of NGOs, senior officials, members of the UN agencies being implicated in cases of sexual abuse, exploitation, sexual harassment. Senior officials are given full paid suspension, then thanked, congratulated, and then sent on their way with a fantastic long-term service history. Again, dignified on exit. So, London. Thomas Reuters Foundation reported the leading aid agencies received at least 539 reports of sexual harassment, exploitation, sex abuse in 2018. Well, 2017, it was 13% less. So it's gone up 13% in a year. So, and it's still increasing, this sexual abuse by leading global aid agencies. So Paul Donovan, a co-director of what they call Code Blue, set about a campaign seeking accountability of abuses made involving UN personnel. And she said, She was doubtful that the UN's commitment to stamp out abuse and called the figures that the UN produces as to the abuses happening at the hands of the UN as bogus figures. The UN and global aid agencies, NGOs, playing down the true figures of sexual exploitation, stating that the numbers reported by the UN are not actual data, but a random selection of partial figures. She called this the UN playing at the rules of its own rules, the playing of its own rules, its own game, holding back information from the public. So in 2017, Associated Press investigation revealed more than 100 peacekeeping troops ran a child sex ring in Haiti, and that took part over a period of 10 years, and none of those perpetrators were ever jailed, were not held accountable. They got away with it, and over 12 years, 2,000 allegations of sexual abuse, exploitation by UN peacekeepers and other UN personnel at all levels were involved in exploitation, sex exploitation, and sexual abuse. And the Associated Press reported that US Ambassador to the UN, who was Nikki Haley, urged that all countries hold UN peacekeepers accountable for their crimes of sexual abuse and exploitation. But obviously it's not happening because it's still increasing. So in 2004, Amnesty International reported underage girls being kidnapped, tortured, forced into prostitution. They were forced into prostitution. This was in Kosovo, with UN and NATO personnel being the customers that were driving the demand for sex slaves. The UN acknowledged at the time that peacekeepers have come to be seen as part of the problem and not the solution. Reporters witnessed rapid increases in prostitution in Cambodia, Mozambique, Bosnia, and Kosovo after UN NATO forces entered those regions. Instances of abuses in Cambodia caused widespread outrage after many of the abused women actually got AIDS, HIV. And they say prior to their entry into the country, the UN troops, that there was no little to no AIDS, HIV. It just increased like that as soon as these forces entered this country. So it hadn't been prevalent among the local population where they were. So Kosovo Victim Support reported a third of local prostitutes were under the age of 14 years old. Amnesty said victims were routinely raped as a means of control and coercion, kept in terrible conditions, many often locked in dark rooms, never seeing daylight. So in Haiti, Sri Lankan peacekeepers, UN peacekeepers, used boys and girls as young as 12 as sexual slaves, used them in sexual exploitation, sexual abuse. One victim, a girl of 12 years old, said from the age of 12 to 15, she had sex with 40 peacekeeping troops. She was kept. She slept in the back of UN trucks on UN bases. This was reported by Associated Press. This is not just talk. This is not conspiracy theory. This really happened. And in Haiti, UN troops were actually 134 of them were operating a child sex ring, luring children with candy and cash. That was reported by Associated Press. It was highly publicised that members of the UN peacekeeping forces were accused of direct involvement in the procurement of sex slaves for a local brothel in Bosnia. So, people, I urge you to find, if you can search out a movie called Whistleblower, which was directed by Larissa Kondraki, she was based in as a peacekeeper in post-war Bosnia. And this movie is based on this Nebraskan police officer, Catherine, who served as a peacekeeper in Bosnia, and she outed the UN covering up large sex scandal. This film featured Vanessa Redgrave as one of the actresses. So seek that out and you will see what was actually going on in Bosnia, at least part of it. So UN troops in Haiti and Sudan have been accused of sexual abuse of children between 2004 and 2007. An internal UN report documented over 100 UN soldiers were sent home from their involvement in a sex ring. None were ever charged. In 2015, there was more disclosure of UN. Thousands of allegations of forced sex with UN soldiers in return for material aid and medication, and these involve minors, children. In Central African Republic, at least 98 girls said they've been sexually abused by international peacekeepers. UN troops from Burundi, Gabon were accused of sexual abuse and exploitation in Central African Republic between 2014 and 2015. The identified troops left the country, were sent back to Sri Lanka, were never sentenced to prison. They got away with it. And this is what happens. UN Agenda 2030, protect women, girls, children. There you go. UN Agenda 2030, global sustainable development. Societies at large must end practices that critically endanger women's health, their well-being, all forms of gender violence. What bloody rubbish. They are committing this crime, sexual violation. This is a mirror image of what is happening. The UN are their own mirror image of committing these crimes against women, boys, children. UN Sustainable Development Agenda 2030 Development Goal Pacific Target SDG 16.2, the right of every child to live free from fear, neglect, abuse, exploitation. They need calling out. And yet we have the UN ruling every part of our lives. Our government is the long arm of the UN. What the hell is happening here? NGOs, in NATO, the UN agencies, UN peacekeeping forces, UN personnel, global agency, UN member country leaders, they've all damn well failed. All colluded with sexual abuse, sexual exploitation, genocide, torture, mass surveillance, and massive detention camps in communist China. They're all allies because no one has taken them to account, and they get away with it. So when politicians, leaders in the toilet bowl of Wellington never open up about these things, you know they are allies. They're on their side. When they change a word, genocide, to human rights abuses, which could mean anything, you know they are downplaying what is actually happening with the UN itself. They are the long arm of the UN. They are allies to all these criminal behaviours. They're as guilty as hell, and they don't give a damn shit. So these are globalists, the one world governance that dictates to us all our laws around health, around human rights, that are bringing in hate speech. All part of Andrew Little. Our government is the long arm of the UN. And that's what we have. Traitors to the New Zealand people. And if David Seymour speaks up and says, oh, I'm talking about freedom of speech, and he does his New Zealand tour, no, he doesn't. Because he doesn't tell you about this. He doesn't tell you about the sexual crimes that are going on, that are underreported, that are never spoken up about in our state institutions. They are left under the covers. So they are all damn guilty. So please share, share, share and subscribe. And please, people, I urge you, Thursday night, watch Counterspin. I will put on a video before then to tell you more about what is coming up on episode 6. Thank you. Share, share, share and subscribe.